A widow without money knocked on the door of a millionaire to ask for a job, but he expelled her without even looking at her face. Hours later, he saw an old photo that made him recognize that woman, and the weight of his decision left him devastated. Hello. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe and activate notifications. The sun had barely risen when Rosa Maria found herself standing at the imposing gates of Don Fernando's grand estate. Her hands trembled as she gripped the worn fabric of her shawl, a futile shield. Against the crisp morning air, the mansion before her was a vision of opulence. Its marble columns gleamed in the sunlight, manicured gardens stretched endlessly, and the faint sound of classical music wafted through the air. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the massive oak doors. A butler answered, his eyes narrowing at the sight of her frayed dress and weathered face. "I need to speak to Don Fernando," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm here to ask for work. Anything, cleaning, cooking, whatever he needs." The butler hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let her into the marble foyer. Rosa Maria's eyes darted around, taking in the glittering chandelier, the polished floors, and the sense of wealth that seemed to permeate every inch of the space. After what felt like an eternity, Don Fernando appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Dressed in a tailored suit, he looked every bit the powerful man he was rumored to be. His sharp features conveyed authority, but his expression remained indifferent as his gaze landed on her. "What is this about?" he asked curtly, descending the stairs with measured steps. Rosa Maria took a deep breath, summoning her courage. "Senor, I've heard you might need help around the estate. I'm a hard worker and But Don Fernando cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We don't take in strangers. Off the street. I have no use for beggars." The words stung, but Rosa Maria refused to flinch. She straightened her posture, meeting his cold gaze. "I am not a beggar, senor. I'm a widow trying to provide for my children. Surely you can understand." "I understand," he interrupted, his tone icy, "that my time is not to be wasted. Leave." The butler stepped forward as if to escort her out, but Rosa Maria remained rooted in place. For a brief moment, she studied Don Fernando's face, as though searching for a trace of the boy she once knew. She gave a faint, enigmatic smile, before turning to leave. The moment lingered as the heavy doors closed behind her. Don Fernando dismissed the encounter from his mind, returning to his study to resume his day. Yet, as he sipped his morning coffee, a nagging sense of unease crept into his thoughts. Outside the gates, Rosa Maria walked away with her head held high, her poverty stark against the backdrop of wealth she had just left behind. Though humiliated, she felt a spark of satisfaction. He hadn't recognized her, but she remembered him, and the past had a way of catching up, even with the most powerful. Don Fernando's study was a sanctuary of order, with bookshelves reaching to the ceiling and an antique desk dominating the center of the room. It was here he often retreated, to escape the chaos of his world. This morning, however, he wasn't working. He was searching. His daughter Camilla was coming for a brief visit, and she had requested something specific, an old bracelet that had belonged to her late mother. He opened drawer after drawer, methodically sifting through their contents until he came across a wooden box tucked into a corner. It was unassuming, its varnish faded, and the lid creaked as he opened it. Inside was a jumble of trinkets and photographs, remnants of a life he had tried to leave behind. His hand paused as he lifted a black and white photo. Two figures smiled back at him. A young girl with braided hair and a gentle expression, standing beside a woman in a simple dress. The girl's eyes were unmistakable. They belonged to Rosa Maria. The recognition hit him like a wave, and with it came the memories he had buried for decades. He sank into the leather chair behind his desk, staring at the photograph as fragments of his childhood surfaced. He saw himself as a scrawny boy, struggling to carry a heavy sack of grain through the village market. The weight had been too much, and he had stumbled, spilling the contents onto the dirt road. Laughter from nearby stalls had stung his pride. But then she had appeared, the girl with the braided hair, Rosa Maria. She had helped him gather the grain without saying a word, her small hands working quickly and efficiently. When she was done, she had offered him a piece of bread from her basket. "It's not much," she had said, smiling, "but everyone deserves a little kindness." That simple act had stayed with him, though he had never thanked her properly. And now, years later, he had repaid her kindness with cruelty. The memory burned, and Don Fernando clenched the photograph tightly. His encounter with Rosa Maria at the door the previous day replayed in his mind, her dignified yet weary face, contrasting with the vibrant girl from his past. His chest tightened with guilt, the weight of his indifference pressing down on him. He had built his fortune by forgetting where he came from, severing ties with the boy he once was. But now, confronted by this ghost of his past, he realized that some wounds could only be healed by facing the truth. Don Fernando set the photograph on his desk, his mind racing. Rosa Maria had returned to his life for a reason, and ignoring it was no longer an option. Don Fernando sat at his desk, staring at the photograph of young Rosa Maria and her mother. The guilt that had begun to gnaw at him earlier now consumed him entirely. The memory of her dignified yet pleading face at his doorstep haunted him. He had to find her, but where to start? The next morning, Don Fernando instructed his driver to prepare the car. His usual meticulous schedule was abandoned as he ventured into neighborhoods he hadn't seen in years. The outskirts of the city were a stark contrast to the polished world he inhabited. The streets were narrow, filled with the chatter of vendors, the cries of children, and the weary faces of workers. He approached small shops, hesitant at first, but determined. "I'm looking for a woman named Rosa Maria," he said to an elderly vendor selling tortillas. The woman squinted at him, clearly unimpressed by his tailored suit and polished shoes. "Rosa Maria," she repeated, shaking her head. "That's a common name around here. You'll need to be more specific." Don Fernando described her as best as he could. Her age, her features, the weary dignity in her eyes. The vendor frowned, her hands pausing mid-motion as she folded a tortilla. "Maybe try the church down the road. People in need often go there." The church was modest, its whitewashed walls cracked with age. Inside, Don Fernando found a priest arranging candles. The priest listened intently to his query, his expression unreadable. "Many come here for help, Don Fernando," the priest said after a moment. "But we don't keep records of everyone. If she has sought refuge here, it's not for me to say." The response frustrated him, but it also humbled him. For the first time, he felt the weight of his privilege. He was a man accustomed to instant results, but now he was at the mercy of those he had long overlooked. As the day wore on, Don Fernando's search took him deeper into the city's less fortunate areas. Each conversation chipped away at his arrogance. He met people who worked tirelessly for scraps, their resilience a stark reminder of the life he had left behind. His thoughts drifted to Camilla. She would arrive in a few days, and their relationship had grown distant in recent years. He had always justified his absence with his work, but now he saw how shallow that excuse was. How could he expect to repair his bond with her if he couldn't even face the consequences of his own actions? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets, Don Fernando felt a flicker of hope. A young boy selling flowers mentioned a woman who matched Rosa Maria's description, living in a nearby neighborhood. "Her children sometimes play in the park," the boy added. Don Fernando's heart raced. He was closer than he had been all day. Yet, as he walked toward the park, a question loomed in his mind. Would she even speak to him? after what he had done. The narrow alley was lined with makeshift homes, their walls cobbled together from rusted metal and weathered wood. Don Fernando's polished shoes crunched against the gravel, the stark contrast of his tailored suit drawing cautious stares from the neighborhood's inhabitants. He clutched the note the flower boy had given him, its hastily scrawled directions, leading him to a weathered door at the far end of the street. He hesitated for a moment before knocking, the sound of children laughing carried from inside, followed by hurried footsteps. The door opened to reveal Rosa Maria, her face marked with surprise and guarded hostility as she recognized him. "You!" she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "Rosa Maria," Don Fernando began, but the words caught in his throat. Her appearance struck him deeply. Her once bright eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and her clothes bore the evidence of hard labor. Behind her, two small children peeked out, their wide eyes filled with curiosity. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, stepping forward to block his view of the interior. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice faltering. "I realize now how wrong I was. I didn't recognize you at first, but now you do," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "And you think that changes anything?" Don Fernando took a step back, startled by the intensity in her gaze. "I want to make amends," he said, almost pleading. Rosa Maria laughed bitterly. "Amends? Do you think you can fix this with an apology or money? Do you think that will erase the humiliation I endured at your doorstep?" The children, sensing the tension, retreated into the house. Rosa Maria crossed her arms, her stance unyielding. "I didn't know it was you," he admitted, shame coloring his words. "But even if I had, I shouldn't have treated anyone like that." "And yet you did," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. "I knew who you were the moment I saw you. I could have begged, could have reminded you of who I was, but I didn't, because my dignity is all I have left, and I won't trade it for anyone's pity, not even yours." Don Fernando looked down, her words cutting deeper than he expected. "You're right," he said after a pause. "I've spent so long chasing success that I forgot the person I used to be, the person your family helped when I had nothing." The mention of her family made Rosa Maria's expression soften, but only slightly. "Then perhaps you should ask yourself what kind of man you've become," she said quietly. A heavy silence settled between them. Don Fernando felt exposed, his carefully constructed image crumbling under her gaze. "Let me help you," he said eventually, not out of pity, but because it's the right thing to do. Rosa Maria shook her head. "Help isn't something you can force on someone. If you truly mean what you say, you'll respect my decision." He nodded reluctantly, understanding the firmness in her voice. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at the humble home, the children's voices faintly audible from within. "I'll be here if you ever change your mind," he said, his tone earnest. Rosa Maria watched him go, her expression unreadable. Once he disappeared from view, she leaned against the doorframe, her thoughts swirling. His words had stirred something within her, a flicker of doubt, a whisper of possibilities she wasn't ready to face. Inside, her children ran to her, their innocent chatter pulling her back to the present. For now, she would hold on to the life she had built, fragile as it was, but a part of her wondered if perhaps there was room for something more. The next morning, Don Fernando stood in his office, gazing out of the expansive window that overlooked the bustling city. The weight of the previous day's encounter with Rosa Maria lingered in his mind, like a persistent shadow he couldn't shake. With a determined breath, he turned back to his desk, where a proposal sat unfinished, a plan for a community project aimed at supporting women in need. He knew it wasn't enough to simply offer Rosa Maria help. This project could be more than just an apology. It could be a way to bring lasting change, not only for her, but for others like her. Picking up the phone, he called his assistant to schedule a meeting with Rosa Maria. 2 days later, Rosa Maria arrived at the same office where Fernando had once dismissed her. This time, however, she entered with caution rather than desperation. Fernando greeted her with a tentative smile, gesturing for her to sit. "I appreciate you coming," he began. "I've been working on a project to support women facing hardships, offering training, employment opportunities, and resources. To rebuild their lives, I'd like you to help lead it." Rosa Maria's eyes narrowed, her skepticism evident. "Why me?" she asked. "Is this some sort of guilt-driven charity?" Fernando met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because you understand the struggles these women face better than anyone. Your strength and resilience make you uniquely qualified to guide others. This isn't about pity, it's about purpose." The room fell silent as Rosa Maria weighed his words. Part of her wanted to reject the offer outright, wary of his intentions. Yet the idea of helping other women who shared her pain and struggles, sparked a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her tone guarded. That evening, Rosa Maria walked through her modest neighborhood, passing by women who greeted her with tired smiles and children playing in the dusty streets. The thought of making a tangible difference in their lives began to resonate deeply. By the time she returned home, her decision was made. The following week, Rosa Maria joined Fernando's project, her initial apprehension gradually giving way to determination. She threw herself into the work, organizing workshops, meeting with local women, and listening to their stories. Slowly, she began to see the impact of her efforts, not only on others, but on herself. During this time, Camilla returned home for a break from her studies abroad. She was surprised to see her father working so closely with someone like Rosa Maria, a stark contrast to the distant, cold man she had known. Curious, Camilla struck up conversations with Rosa Maria during their interactions at the community center. She found herself drawn to Rosa Maria's warmth and wisdom, qualities that reminded her of her late mother. In time, their connection grew into something neither of them had anticipated, a bond that felt almost familial. "You remind me of someone I lost," Camilla admitted one afternoon as they worked side by side. Rosa Maria smiled softly, sensing the vulnerability in Camilla's voice. "And you remind me of someone I'm trying to be for my own children, a source of strength." Meanwhile, Don Fernando watched from a distance as the two women formed their bond. It filled him with a bittersweet pride, but also highlighted his own strained relationship with Camilla. He approached her cautiously one evening, hoping to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. "Camilla," he began hesitantly, "I see how much you've grown, and I realize I've been distant, too focused on the wrong things. I want to change that." Camilla looked at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "It's not that simple," she said. "You can't just decide to fix things overnight." "I know," Fernando replied, "but I'm willing to put in the effort. I just need you to give me a chance." Their conversation ended without resolution, but it was a start, a tentative step toward healing. As days turned into weeks, the community project flourished under Rosa Maria's guidance. The center became a sanctuary for women seeking refuge and hope. And though the path to reconciliation was far from smooth, the seeds of change had been planted in Fernando's relationships with both Rosa Maria and Camila. The grand hall was alive with murmurs and anticipation as employees, partners, and members of the local community gathered for Don Fernando's annual company gala. This year, however, the usual air of opulence was subdued by a different tone, one of humility and purpose. At the center of it all stood Don Fernando, dressed impeccably but wearing an expression far more vulnerable than anyone had ever seen. Taking the stage, he gazed out at the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he began. Tonight, he said, is not about profits or accolades. It is about recognizing something far more important, the people who truly make a difference. The room quieted as Fernando paused, gathering his thoughts. For years, I lived in a world that revolved around power and wealth, blind to the struggles of those less fortunate. Recently, I was confronted with the reality of how disconnected I had become. Someone, a person of great strength and dignity, showed me how much I had forgotten. Rosa Maria stood near the back of the room, her heart pounding as she realized where his speech was headed. Rosa Maria, Fernando said, his voice carrying across the hall, is one of those people. She embodies resilience and integrity, qualities I once ignored in my pursuit of success. Her strength has inspired not just me, but everyone involved. In our new community initiative, gasps and whispers rippled through the audience. Many turned to look at Rosa Maria, who shifted uncomfortably under the attention. Fernando continued, his voice breaking slightly. It's time we celebrate people like her, those who show us what true courage looks like, and it's time we hold ourselves accountable for the ways we've failed to support them. The crowd erupted into applause, but Fernando's eyes sought only Rosa Maria's. She held his gaze for a moment before nodding, her expression unreadable. Later, as the event wound down, Fernando approached Rosa Maria, who stood alone by a small table. "I hope I didn't overstep," he said quietly. "I meant every word." Rosa Maria crossed her arms, her posture still guarded. "Words are easy, Don Fernando. Actions are harder. But maybe you're starting to understand that." "I am," he admitted, "and I hope you'll let me prove it." Rosa Maria exhaled slowly, her defenses softening just slightly. "I'll take the job, but let me be clear, my dignity isn't for sale. If I'm going to work with you, it'll be as equals." Fernando nodded solemnly. "Agreed. I wouldn't expect anything less." As they shook hands, an unspoken understanding passed between them. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a step towards something greater. Nearby, Camilla watched the exchange with quiet admiration. When Fernando turned to her, she approached him hesitantly. "Papa," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I've been watching you. For the first time in a long while, I feel like I can be proud of you." Fernando's eyes widened, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Camilla." She placed a hand on his arm, her expression earnest. "You're trying. That's what matters. And I think you're starting to see what really counts." In that moment, Fernando felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His daughter's approval, something he had longed for without realizing, filled a void he hadn't been able to name. The evening ended with a mix of celebration and reflection. Rosa Maria walked home with a sense of newfound agency, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a force of change, for herself and others. For Fernando, the night marked the beginning of his redemption. He knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time, he felt he was on the right path. As father and daughter left the venue together, Camilla linked her arm through Fernando's. "Maybe it's time we start rebuilding what we lost," she said. Fernando nodded, his heart swelling with hope. "I'd like that," he replied, his voice steady. And so, with tentative but genuine steps, two lives once fractured began the slow process of healing. Together. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly refurbished community center, casting a warm glow over the bustling activity inside. Rosa Maria stood near a table, organizing supplies for the workshop she was about to lead. Around her, a group of women chatted and laughed, their faces showing a mixture of hope and determination. For Rosa Maria, this was more than just a job. It was a lifeline. The program offered training and support for women who had faced hardships, and she was both a mentor and a beneficiary. As she explained the day's activities, her voice carried a new confidence. One of the women, A young mother named Elena approached her during a break. "Rosa Maria, I just wanted to say, your story inspires me. Seeing how far you've come gives me hope for my own future." Rosa Maria smiled, touched by the words. "We all have strength we don't realize," she said. "Sometimes it just takes the right moment or the right people to bring it out." Meanwhile, across town, Don Fernando sat at his dining table with Camilla. Their relationship, once strained and distant, had begun to heal in small but meaningful ways. "Papa," Camilla said, setting down her coffee cup, "I was thinking, maybe I could help with the community project on weekends. I've seen how much it's meant to you, and to Rosa Maria." Fernando's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "That would mean a lot to me, and I think it would mean even more to the women there. You've always had a way of connecting with people, Camila." She shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "I guess I learned that from Mom." At the mention of his late wife, Fernando's expression softened. Her absence was still a quiet ache in his life, but for the first time in years, he felt he was honoring her memory by becoming the man she had believed he could be. Later that evening, as Fernando sorted through old papers in his study, he stumbled upon a letter in his wife's handwriting. The edges were worn, and the ink had faded slightly with time. Opening it cautiously, he began to read. "My dearest Fernando, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. There's something I've kept from you, not out of deceit, but out of fear of what it might do to our family. You've always been a man of strength, but there's a part of your past you must confront. I hope one day you'll find the courage to face it for the sake of your own peace." Fernando's hands trembled as he finished the letter. What secret could she have been referring to? And why had she chosen to keep it hidden? As the night deepened, the question lingered in his mind, casting a shadow over the newfound light in his life. It was a reminder that even in redemption, the past could not be ignored, and that his journey was far from over. Don't miss our next videos. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notifications button. What did this story seem like to you? Leave your comment.